Welcome to Postcards from Barnesville. I'm Pamela Morris, that witchy chick. This is the place where I will share some of the short stories I've written over the years that may otherwise spend their dark lives feeling lonely and unloved. And nobody wants that. Hello, and welcome to Spooky October and episode 8 of Postcards from Barnesville. There is a one-room schoolhouse not 10 miles from the small town where I grew up, and I'm told that my grandfather went there as a child in the 20s. I believe it only went up to the 8th grade. I've never known it to be occupied. It has gotten fixed up a little bit here and there, and it has always fascinated me. It is a dream of mine to own this place someday. I can only hope that the dreams I have wouldn't turn into the nightmare experienced by the narrator of our next tale. I call this one The Schoolhouse. It had stood alone and empty for as long as I could remember, and that was for a good 40 years back. In all that time, I'd always coveted the old one-room schoolhouse. Its history defied every attempt I made to seek it out. Lips became sealed, eyes turned away, and doors refused to open. Emails and letters went unanswered. Phone calls and texts were never returned. Not one word of information or even gossip could be gotten from anyone that lived in the village just 3 miles away. Even the historical societies and libraries I'd visited spoke not a word of the place. I only knew one thing about the schoolhouse without a shadow of a doubt. When I drove by and saw the for sale sign out front, I knew it would be mine. For months after the purchase, I could not enter any public building within a 10-mile radius of the schoolhouse without drawing a wary eye or averted whisper from someone. People were friendly enough because I think they felt they should be. I had never lived in Myers Knob, but my ancestors had been part of the first group of white settlers in the area. Many generations of my family lay buried in the small cemetery behind the Episcopal Church. I had been baptized in that same church. Despite all that, I felt an outsider, as if the close-knit residents suffered from mass amnesia. I was someone who only looked familiar because I bore such a strong resemblance to my mother who had grown up there. They should know me, but the fact they didn't cast me out and made my purchase of the schoolhouse all the more intrusive into their world. Every chance I got, I went to community events. The chicken barbecues hosted by the volunteer fire department, the spaghetti suppers put on by the church's youth group, and the monthly potluck dinners held in the Grange Hall all saw me there, trying to inch my way into a part of a world that didn't really seem to want me. None of this deterred me. They were never in the least bit unkind. In fact, they were almost too generous with their smiles and offers of help. I was a bona fide curiosity that they seemed averse to speak about the little house that stood on the hill, vacant and hollow for so many years. They all had the same look in their eyes, as one about to ask a question but afraid to do so. Lips would part and brows would crease, and just as quickly those things would slip away, replaced by a too big smile. Any question I posed met with the same expression and fate. "Oh, I really don't know anything about the place," was the standard reply. They'd suggest people I could ask, of course, but those people were never available. It was my hope that eventually I'd win the trust of the right person. I'd become part of the inner circle of knowing whatever it seemed so vital I not know about the place. In the meantime, I went about my business, making the 30 by 30 foot square place habitable in time for winter. I wanted to keep the building as historically correct as I could, but I needed to be sensible about it and bring other things up to code. The electrician told me the wiring dated back to the 1950s and would never pass inspection. We found a way to fix that and keep the integrity of the wainscoted lath and plaster walls. I had the spaces between the ceiling and the roof and the walls filled with blown-in insulation. The original windows were carefully repaired and storms custom made. A septic system was installed. By September, I had created a working bathroom out of what once had been a storage room at the back of the building. Another storage space, what I called the cloakroom, was cleaned out and fitted with shelves and wall hooks for my needs. The remainder of the school was to keep its original one-room, open floor plan. The compact kitchen would seat 4, a rather generous dream on my part. I seldom had guests, even in my previous home. I wasn't much interested in entertaining people. I spent a massive amount of my budget on a gas cook stove that looked like a cast iron wood one I remembered my great-aunt using for countless Thanksgiving meals. As a historical focal point, I also procured a cast iron pot-bellied stove as a second source of heat. I'd always loved the smell of a real wood stove and had it set up in the same spot the original would have been. It was all coming together so perfectly, so flawlessly. I could not have been happier. Sadly, others were not so pleased with my progress. I heard them for the first time as October was making itself comfortable between the rolling hills, dappled with leaves of golden yellow and brilliant red. Children began rapping on the outside walls or windows before running off to hide in the rows of sun-dried cornfields that bordered the place on 2 sides. I paid them no mind. It was harmless enough, and I was well aware they wanted me to react with some sort of shouting and threats to stay off my property. They wanted me to turn into the grumpy old lady who waves her fists at them. I refused to give them the satisfaction. It was the Sunday before Halloween when I mentioned this continuing disturbance to a fellow church attendant. It was my way of letting the community know I was being pestered by its children. The woman I spoke of was a known gossip. Word would get around quickly enough, especially as I said it quietly while nibbling on a lemon cookie and sipping tea at the monthly after-service social. Intentionally, I lowered my voice so this woman, some dear friend of the priest's wife, would have to lean into my words and listen intently as if some great secret was being placed between us. Her doughy, weather-worn skin grew a touch pinker. "Oh," she said, her jowls shuddering as she spoke and shook her head. "Those little brats. They ain't got much to amuse themselves around here, you know. I'll ask around. Discreetly, of course." Of course. In all my work, I'd practically forgotten about the approach of Halloween and decided maybe it was best if I kept my guard up more than usual when the night arrived. The schoolhouse was centrally isolated, an easy target with few witnesses to tattle on any who might wander by and lob an egg or rotten tomato in its direction. To be honest, though, even as this thought came to me, I could not see any of the children I'd met doing such a thing. Nights later, they came around again. This time they were braver. I was in the kitchen putting away leftovers when I heard footsteps on the front porch. They ran across, click, 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 the sound of hard-soled shoes from one end to the other. My front screen door squeaked open. They pounded on the inner door, then rattled the knob. As I turned, I was sure I saw a flash of movement beyond the screen door slamming shut again. Annoyed, I went to the door, yanked it open, and stepped into the cold, crisp air. A few stray crickets chirped as a faint breeze rustled the corn stalks. Moving as slowly and quietly as possible, I walked to the end of the porch opposite the steps, leaned slightly forward over the rail, and listened. There was absolutely nothing to see or hear. Maybe they had gone around to the back of the schoolhouse, or, most likely, ducked into the rows of corn. At the top of the steps, I lingered a second time to listen and watch. Crickets chirped in the gentle breeze. A soft, distant roll of thunder trembled miles further up the valley. I returned inside, closed and locked both doors, and drew the curtains for the night. The threat of a storm would surely send the mischief-makers running for home. Several hours later, as I turned out my bedroom light, the rain began to splatter down on the tin roof. Laying back in the darkness, I couldn't help but smile. As a girl, I'd always rushed out to sit on the front porch whenever a storm came. There was just something about the sound that soothed me and excited me at the same time. Like a million tiny hearts beating in rhythm, it lulled me back to those perfect days. Morning dawned, crisp and clear. Coffee in hand and wrapped in my thick housecoat, I ventured onto the front porch. It was a moment I had long dreamed of. The air was sharp with the tang of autumn leaves and ripe corn. Every now and then a waft of apples would drift by from an old tree that stood by the road. The schoolhouse sat on a small rise with a cornfield fencing in the back and western portions of the property line. Across the road and over a soft, sloping field of well-trodden grass, water rippled and sparkled in the sunlight. Black and white dairy cows lumbered along, lowed to one another, and nibbled at the stubbled earth. As I looked east toward the village, I drew in a deep, calming breath and closed my eyes, reveling in everything around me. With my steaming mug curled up against my collarbone, I realized with vivid clarity that I was home. This was my place, all mine. It held no past memories, only future dreams. I was of that age when the kids were grown and on their own. I'd been divorced close to 5 years, and with no signs of hope for any sort of personal relationship on the horizon, I'd made the leap of faith into the unknown. I no longer needed a 4-bedroom, 1.5-bath house, so I'd sold it, somewhat to the dismay of my children. 2 days before Halloween, I traveled to the local pumpkin farm. The place was packed. Normally, crowds bothered me, but that day nothing could have ruined my mood. I was blissfully happy and content, picking out 3 medium-sized pumpkins for carving, along with some other goodies I planned to use as Christmas gifts. On my way home, I stopped and picked up some candy. It seemed unlikely I'd get any trick-or-treaters, but better safe than sorry. If no one came, well, there would go 20 pounds I'd lost over the summer working on the schoolhouse. As night settled over the hills on either side of the school, I started a small fire in the pot-bellied stove. They were calling for snow that night, and I loathed the idea of turning on the furnace just yet. Besides, the smell of wood smoke and fresh-carved pumpkin would be the perfect ending to what had been one of many perfect days for me lately. I'd bought a small apple pie at the pumpkin farm, too, and meant to have it with some vanilla ice cream and apple cider once I'd done my pumpkin carving. A program on haunted places babbled in the background as I set to work. I was no Michelangelo, but I can do a fair job of carving, and with a couple of hours I'd made my masterpieces and set them on the wide railing of the front porch. It had become my tradition to light them for 3 nights, the nights before and after Halloween, as well as the night itself. I walked down to the end of my short gravel drive and looked back at the schoolhouse and my happy jack-o'-lanterns. She came out of nowhere and nearly knocked me off my feet. Running and laughing, the figure must have darted out of the upper cornfield and around to the back of the house. Her face was covered with a kind of homemade mask, like a white decorated paper plate tied around her head with string. Faceless or not, there was no mistaking the bobbed red hair, even in the dimly lit front yard. At first, I thought she was wearing a nightgown as she rounded the corner, and I came to my senses enough to look twice. I saw it was more an old-fashioned smock-style dress. It came to her knees, and below it she wore dark knee-high socks and scuffed black shoes. There was a flash of a big ribbon in her hair, and then she was gone. "Hey!" I yelled, running after her. By the time I reached the corner of the house, she was nowhere to be seen. I slowed my pace, but kept going, eyeing the corn stalks for any signs of movement within. What a glorious day it would be when those were harvested and I could see. Hurrying my way to the back of the building, the girl remained elusive until I heard her giggles. I froze. I actually shivered, to tell the truth. I knew she was only a child, but the hair on my arms stood straight on end, and I strained to hear anything more. When the sound was repeated, I cursed. It came from under the house. Damn it, I thought. She'd wiggled her way into the crawl space. Now I was getting pissed, and stomped over to the small wooden door, flipped up the hook latch, and yanked it open. "Get out of there right now," I screamed into the darkness. "Come on, I know you're under there." A ringing silence came back to me. Ice seemed to drip down the back of my neck as I straightened and stepped away from the opening. The silver latch, newly installed only months ago, hung motionless and gloating. It had been locked from the outside. The girl could not be under the house, but I'd heard her laugh. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe she'd been around the corner. Either way, she was likely long gone by now. Wherever she was, it was too dark, and I was too cold to waste more time looking for her. She'd wanted a reaction, and I wasn't too pleased with myself for giving it to her so easily. Annoyed, I circled around to the front and returned to the comforts of my wood stove, apple pie, and cider. The dead of night lay heavy in the valley when I opened my eyes to the sound of banging. Outside, the leafless lilac bush flapped against the window near my bed. Grumbling, I rolled towards it and closed my eyes, trying to block the sound out. Insistently it tapped and scraped, its branches shuddering in the wind. A steady rhythm took place, thudding. Tap, tap, tap. Knock, knock, knock. I lifted my head from the pillow to hear better. I stared at the window. The knocking went counter to the movement of the shrub. It wasn't coming from the window. It was near the wood stove. My body relaxed. That had to be it. The fire was going out and the metal snapping, just like the ticking of an engine as it cooled. Goosebumps rose on my bare arms. Yes, the fire was going out. I may as well get up and put more wood on while I was awake. Thud, thud, thud. The floor vibrated under me. Through the bottoms of my feet it came again. Someone was under the floor. Panic tightened in my stomach. What if I'd accidentally locked that little girl under there? Dear God! Snatching at my robe, then grabbing my flashlight, I jammed my feet into my slippers by the door and hurried into the darkness. Frosty air slammed into my lungs as I gasped. "Hold on," I yelled. "I'm coming." The grass under my feet crackled with delicate crystals of ice as I hurried to the back of the house. I snapped the hook latch up and yanked the crawl space door open, training my powerful beam under the schoolhouse. "Where are you?" I called out. "Are you okay?" Nothing moved in my line of sight. "Hello, little girl. Come out. Are you hurt?" Lowering myself more, I got down on my hands and knees and crawled half a body length into the space. Laughter erupted from behind me. My body jerked up so hard I bashed my head onto the low floor joists above and barked out a "Shit!" Tiny hands shoved at my backside, pushing me deeper into the cold space. "Get her! Push her in! Lock her up!" I kicked back, but there were so many of them. The beam of my light danced in the dirt across the beams and dripping cobwebs. It reflected back images of everything except the children, whose jeers and cruel laughter I could hear, whose hands pounded on my legs and pushed. I fell to my side at the sound of the door slamming shut. Before I could scramble around to face my attackers, The latch snapped into my place. They'd locked me in. I crawled forward and pushed on the door. It would not yield. "Open this door, you little brats! Open it right now!" "Trick or treat!" Their laughter taunted me from the other side. "How do you like it, bitch? How do you like the dark? Who's playing tricks now, huh?" I pounded on the blockage, screaming at them until my throat was raw and my fists bled. When I stopped, it was quiet and oh, so cold. "Why are you doing this?" I sobbed into the dirt. "Who are you?" How the hell was I going to get out of here? My head was throbbing. My teeth chattered. Plumes of cold breathed out between my shuddering lips. The lit flashlight lay in the dirt where I dropped it. I picked it up to aim it at the door, then reached out with my free hand. Before I could touch it, the door yawned open, as if it had never been locked at all. You are listening to The Schoolhouse by Pamela Morris. If you're enjoying this tale and would like more, visit my website, PamelaMorrisBooks.com, for a full selection of my available novels and collections. Link is in the description below. And now, back to the story. The children were long gone by the time I pulled myself out and was able to stand again. The cold of the ground had cut itself painfully in my bones. Aching and angry, I slammed this door and latched it shut. Whoever the little bastards were, it was too dark, and I was too cold and sore to waste more time looking for them. Despite the wood I added to the potbelly, it was as if my bones had turned to ice. Under an added blanket, I shivered. It wasn't fear. These were only children, bored and looking to have some fun at my expense. I'd not be so subtle with my recounting of the incident next time I went into town. A wave of goosebumps rose on my bare arms as I tried to burrow deeper into the blankets and eventually dozed off. Thump, thump, thump. The floor vibrated beneath my bed. There was a pause as I heard the rapid and numerous thumpings of small running feet coming from outside. They had the schoolhouse surrounded. The explosion of dozens of fists beating on the walls in sudden unison shot me out of bed. It even sounded like they were on the roof stomping their feet. The little brats were back. "Trick or treat!" Tiny voices sing-songed from outside. "Trick or treat!" Rage set my heart pounding fast in my chest as I headed towards the door. "Leave me alone!" I shrieked into the darkness. "Haven't you done enough for one night? I'm going to find out who you are, and I'm going to report all of this to the police." It quickly became clear there was nothing there, not even a wandering raccoon or a possum, let alone a brigade of children. Under my feet, the floorboards of the porch creaked as I moved to the steps. The beam of my flashlight scanned first the roadside, then the closer rows of corn. Nothing moved. Even the wind had stilled. It was too early in the morning and too cold to be out here playing hide-and-seek with my imagination. "You've messed with the wrong woman," I uttered loud enough for anyone out there to hear as I trudged back inside and slammed the door to make my point. Come morning, I made another pass around the building's perimeter, finding exactly what I knew I would. Nothing. There were no signs of animals, no footprints, no evidence whatsoever. The crawl space was empty. I lied to myself that all of this was only the effects of the night's strong winds blowing and heaving up from under somewhere, lifting and shifting ancient timbers combined with a very bad dream. I went back to the crawl space door to double-check the lock. The little hook hung free, letting the door drift in and out, tapping against its frame. I was sure I'd latched it. Maybe it was time to get a padlock instead. I could get one down at Gregor's, the little store in the village with 2 outdated gas pumps out front. It was a good reason to stop in, chat, and try to pry into the history of this place one more time. It took 5 minutes to run a brush through my hair, grab my purse, and drive to the store. The owner was a grizzled old man named Ernie, perched on a stool beside a space heater behind the counter. He seemed to have an endless supply of sci-fi novels on hand. "Morning," I said, cheerful, and with what I hoped without any hint of an ulterior motive. "Morning." His snow-white brows rose as he glanced up. I gathered the milk and eggs I needed first before heading around to the section of the window where a scattering of oddball products were shelved. Several types of motor oil, rolls of duct tape, shoestrings, thumbtacks, packs of battery. All manner of locks sat in a neat row. I selected a keyed padlock and the hardware needed to attach it to the door and frame. Ernie dragged his attention from the paperback and placed it face down on the counter to mark his page. "Find everything you need?" "I'm going to need $20 worth of gas, too." The store owner studied the lock and hardware, then me. Maybe it was just my imagination, but for half a second he looked almost hopeful. "You planning on leaving town for a while?" "No," I said. "Why do you think that?" He shrugged, the look of hope slipping away. "Big lock like that. Thought maybe you were going to get the place shut up tight for a while. I heard you're having trouble with the neighborhood kids." I feigned a look of surprise. The church gossip mill worked better than the comments section in social media out here. "Oh, yeah, I did mention that to one of the ladies at church a while ago," as if I'd forgotten. "No, something's getting under the school at night. It keeps waking me up, thumping and knocking around. I think it's a raccoon. They're quite clever, you know. The little hook and eye lock I have isn't working. I thought this might be better." Mr. Gregor went 3 shades paler during my story. He closed his gaping mouth and said, "I see." "I did see a little girl out there, red hair. She and her little friends nearly scared me out to death last night. I thought at first she'd hidden under the building, but when I went to look, she wasn't there." "A little girl with red hair, you say?" His mouth was hanging open again. "Yes, not very old, 10 or 11 maybe. She was wearing a white mask, so I couldn't get a look at her face. Do you know her?" "Sarah," slipped from between his lips. He clamped his mouth shut. "Sarah?" This man wouldn't stand a chance at a poker game if this was the best he could do. I think that's what her name is. Maybe Susie. Family a couple farms up from yours have a girl that age. Could be her." "Them," I corrected, easing more of my story into the open. "There are several. They delight in running up on the porch, knocking on the door and running off, then shoving me under the school and locking me there. Such a nice children you have here in the Knob," I ended with bitter sarcasm. Mr. Gregor snapped into motion, stuffing the lock into the bag as he avoided eye contact. 3714 with the gas. I held 220 out, but did not let go when Ernie took hold of the other end. He looked into my eyes. "What's the story about the schoolhouse?" His lips trembled. "Ain't no story." "To hell there isn't," I insisted, keeping a hold on the bills. "You tell me, and you tell me now, or I am on my way straight to the police station in Owen." His Adam's apple rose and fell. "Ain't after you. They don't mean no harm. They're just confused." He let go of the money. "Excuse me? Confused? They shoved me into the crawl space last night and stood out there laughing about it. I don't think that's being confused. It's being intentionally cruel." "They ain't after you, ma'am. They're after their teacher, Mrs. Roman. That's who they want." The bills crunched into my fist as my hand lowered to the counter. That schoolhouse closed in the mid-60s. I have been able to glean that much of its history from you tight-lipped rednecks. That would make the last child who went there quite grown up by now. Don't feed me any more of this small-town bullshit. I've had more of my fair share of its stench this summer." "Christ," he he muttered. "But don't tell anyone you heard it from me." I can work with that. Back in 15, and by that I mean 1915, Mrs. Roman went crazy, snapped, led all her kids into the schoolyard for recess and told them she had a Halloween surprise for them. She lined them up, shoulder to shoulder, holding hands. School only went to the 4th grade, so they were young. She got 6 of them with an axe. Another half dozen she shot. 5 ran and hid under the building, into that crawl space. She locked them under there until she offed as many as she could, and when she came back, she reloaded and took the ones out beneath there. The one you seen, folks think is Sarah, the last to go. 2 of the kids got away, managed to hide in the cornfield. My mouth had gone dry. What became of Mrs. Roman? He shrugged. That's the problem, ain't it? 2 kids that survived hid until they saw her get into her buggy and leave. Buggy was found in Richfield, all smashed up on that bad curve. Her body was never found, though. Them kids been waiting for her to come back ever since. To teach her a lesson, folks say. Jesus, I sighed. What sort of sickos would keep this kind of thing going for all? His look cut me short. No, he said, that ain't what I mean. I waited, my chest tight and heart racing. The kids are dead. They haunt the place. Best thing you can do is pack up all your things and go. Put the place back up for sale and cut your losses. None around here will buy it, but maybe someone like you come along, you'll get some money from it. You really shouldn't stay there, especially tonight. It's Halloween. I couldn't help it. I rolled my eyes. I thought I told you to spare me the bullshit. His shoulders leveled as he straightened to glare down his fat nose at me. It ain't bullshit. You wanted the truth. I gave it to you. He held out his hand. 3714. Kindly get your gas and be on your way, Mrs. Church. I told you all there is to tell. I threw the 20s at the counter. Keep the change for your mental health jar, I said, and left to fill my gas tank as quickly as possible. Back home, I put away my perishables and set to work replacing the lock. All the while I felt watched and kept looking over my shoulder. I was letting this place get to me. I knew better, but the familiarity of the teacher's surname had stunned me into dumb silence. How was this even possible? I should have stayed down south instead of running after this insane childhood dream. Sane people retired to the south, not the north. Even as a kid, passing through on my way to my grandparents' or cousin's house for one holiday meal or another, I'd known Myers Knob was a strange place. All kinds of crazy rumors and legends drifted in and out of the area, like fog snaking its way through the deeper valleys, its wispy fingers reaching out for a weak, superstitious mind to poison. I was determined not to become like the fools around me who believed in the paranormal. I prepped some beef stew, setting the cast iron pot on the pot belly to simmer the rest of the afternoon away. With a book in hand and a fresh cup of hot tea, I draped a blanket over my lap and stretched out on the sofa, giving the nonsense of it all no more thought. Until the sun set, and the darkness deepened, and the quiet that only isolated country living can bring hung in the air. And I had to go outside to light the jack-o'-lanterns on the porch railing. I looked out the front window. There were no street lights, only stars and a quarter moon. No one would come trick-or-treating way out here. No one would see my carved pumpkins. Why had I even bothered? Flicking on the porch light only made matters worse. It lit up the porch brilliantly, but cast anything more than 15 feet out into an even darker, more ominous gloom. I shut it back off, then back on. Stop it, I growled to myself. Don't be like them. There's nothing out there. Go light your pumpkins and watch some television. Maybe Charlie Brown will be on, or The Nightmare Before Christmas, or your favorite, Hocus Pocus. Drawing in a breath, I squared my shoulders and marched out onto the porch. It was a colder night than the one before, but the air was calm. I glanced to my right, towards the field of corn that had not yet been cut. A misty exhale shimmered in front of me. Lighter in hand, I went to the pumpkin on that end of the porch first and lit the candle inside. The tops of the corn stalks swayed with a passing breeze. Raspy dry leaves brushed against each other, rustling, sounding almost like whispered voices. I quickly moved to the middle jack-o'-lantern and then the last. Darting back inside, I shut the door harder than need be and turned the deadbolt into place. I told myself I was shaking because of the cold, that's all. I wasn't scared, just cold. It was nothing a big steaming hot bowl of stew couldn't fix. At first I wasn't sure if I heard the soft knocking on the door. It was gentle, polite. I shifted my position on the sofa. I hadn't heard any footsteps or a door slam. Was it possible I had a real trick-or-treater? A quick glance out the window revealed no car in my driveway, nor down by the road. The knock came again, just as calm and unhurried as the first time. The placement of the window didn't allow me to see who might be at the door. Retrieving the small candy dish, I moved to the door and opened it, admittedly with a level of trepidation I'd sworn I wouldn't have. I first laid eyes on the girl with the red hair. She stood with 3 others, her hands resting on the shoulders of the 2 on the outermost edges. They wore masks much like hers, homemade with decorated pillowcases or awkwardly cut construction paper and cereal box cardboard. Their clothes were rags, reminded me of every old picture I'd ever seen of a hobo, black and white, grainy, tattered around the edges. "Trick or treat," the red-headed girl said. She was a good 6 inches taller than the rest. "Trick or treat," the younger one echoed. Movement flickered to my right. Others were emerging, stepping forward from the dark, silent, and masked, approaching the bottom of the steps. "I'm not who you think I am." "Trick or treat," she repeated in the cold tone of the dead. This time they all chimed in. A chorus of children's voices resonated through my skin, vaporous, real yet unearthly in their soft, hollow tone. "Trick or treat." The pathetic bowl of candy weighed heavy in my hand. It trembled as I held it out towards them. "Treat," I was able to utter. The girl with the red hair nodded towards those who waited near the steps. Single file they came, the things that nightmares are made of, gray and gauzy, flickering like the original silent horror movie Nosferatu. I'd only bought a small bag of candy. How many children had Mr. Gregor said had been killed? More than 24? 6 with an axe, 6 shot. Then she reloaded. 2 survived. 5 under the school. My brain was frantically doing the math, but without enough information to find the answer for X. Each tiny hand that made its way into the candy dish brought with it the icy touch of the grave, chilling the bowl as if it had been placed in a freezer. My fingers began to numb. A dozen pieces left, and still the children came. 10, 7, 3, 2. The red-headed girl stepped forward. Her dark eyes glistened behind the mask as her head cocked sideways like a curious dog. "Treat," her muffled voice said as her gray-toned hand took the final sweet. "Sarah, I'm not who you think I am," I told her again. "I'm not Mrs. Roman. I'm Irene Church. Mrs. Roman was a distant relative on my mother's side." Her head tipped the other way, her silent gaze piercing through the lopsided holes cut into the ragged cloth. She dropped the candy into her small bag and turned away before once more taking up the hands of the 2 youngest children. She led them down the steps, little feet in little hard-soled shoes. Their tattered clothes rustled as they brushed against each other like the dry leaves of the corn stalks around us. I found myself moving with them as far as the top of the steps, watching as they moved around to the back of the schoolhouse, the trail of fading, featureless shapes drifting out of sight, into the cornfield, under the school, back to wherever it was their teacher had struck them down. I went back inside, listening for them, and didn't sleep until my windows filled with the pink light of dawn. They didn't come back that night, or the week after, or the month after that. I'd survived. I can only hope that Sarah understood what I said. I'm not Mrs. Roman. I only knew the name from a passing story my grandmother used to tell, of a spinster relative, a school teacher who'd lost her life in a buggy crash. But just in case, just to be safe, I'll be sure to buy enough Halloween candy to hand out every year for as long as I live here. You have just listened to Postcards from Barnesville with Pamela Morris, that Witchy Chick. A place for free short stories that otherwise may have spent their dark lives lonely and unloved. Please subscribe and hit that like button if you enjoyed this reading and to keep the stories coming. Be sure to check your mailbox for another postcard from Barnesville, from that Witchy Chick soon. And thank you for listening.